Good morning, historians. Welcome to a discussion today about Japan's rationale for bombing Pearl Harbor. Prior to spring break, in our extended time apart, we spent an extensive amount of time talking about some of the socioeconomic underpinnings of the causes of World War II in Europe, talking about disillusionment and the Great Depression that was global, along with Germany's desire to return to greatness, if you will. But as all of that was occurring in Europe, there was a large undercurrent of Japanese nationalism and Japanese desire to expand westward into Manchuria and into China. And so, as the United States begins to once again look at its proclamation of neutrality, its policy of isolationism, it's finding itself now wedged between two very specific theaters that are ramping up their own individual desires, both the Pacific and Europe. And so today we're going to be spending a little bit of time looking through some primary source documents and asking ourselves a very simple question. Why did Japan decide to bomb Pearl Harbor? It was a country that was about the size of Sweden with regards to population. With physical geography, it was a country that was the size of California. So how was it that the fastly industrializing empire of Japan thought it could put a world of hurt on the United States? And was it a miscalculation on their part? So we're going to be looking at some of those questions now as we move into our discussion for today, which I'm excited and very thrilled to get back into our discussions of U.S. history. I'd like to just take a second and share with you the slideshow that we have, and that is going to begin to look at this proposed message to Congress. In fact, a casual observer of history will be able to see the words of yesterday, December 7th, 1941, and know that it is one of the more famous speeches in American history. Presidential speeches, for me at least historically, do get ranked on importance. I pull from Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address to John F. Kennedy's inaugural address in 1961, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you could do for your country." We also have the 1933 inaugural address by FDR at the height of the Great Depression, telling Americans that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. But it is at this moment, the following day, on December 8th, in which FDR is soliciting support from Congress and the American people on moving forward with plans to engage in a full-scale war with Japan. I'd like you to look at the notes that he has here. I think that's fantastic. I always like seeing the handwritten corrections to any speech. I don't know when these edits were made. Perhaps it was on the drive to the speech or the morning of, or maybe even a few moments before he took the podium. But at any rate, I want to listen to his voice for just a second and follow along and see these changes that are in place. As you can see, it says, "A date which shall live in world history," it says underneath the crossed out portion to the word infamy. Let's listen to FDR this morning.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation, and at the solicitation of Japan, was still in conversation with its government and its emperor, looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific. Indeed, 1 hour after Japanese air squadrons had commenced bombing in the American island of Oahu, the Japanese ambassador to the United States and his colleague delivered to our Secretary of State a formal reply to a recent American message. And while this reply stated that it seemed useless to continue the existing diplomatic negotiations.
So as you could tell, the speech itself goes on for the next 9 minutes and is ended by the culmination of applause and a standing ovation in the chamber of the House of Representatives, a date which will live in infamy. The New York Times, as well as many other newspapers around the country, had very catchy headlines declaring that we are now going to be at war with Japan. And shortly thereafter, a few days after, Germany then declared war on the United States. So the policy of isolationism, which really blanketed the political landscape of the United States prior to World War I with Woodrow Wilson, and in those interwar years, as Germany was advancing. If you recall, Germany was advancing 2 years prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor in both Poland and westward into France and the famous bombardments of London. So the United States throughout all of this did have, to some degree, a proclamation of neutrality or isolationism until FDR really started to engage with the cash and carry and land lease policies between himself and Winston Churchill, which I encourage you to go back and look at in your investigation guide and in the chapter reading. But for our purposes today, I want to simplify our discussion by asking a simple question. Why did Japan decide to attack Pearl Harbor? I'm going to boil it down to socioeconomics. I want to divide today's understanding of the bombing of Pearl Harbor under society and under economics. From a society standpoint, I want to look at the ideologies of Japan, the paradigms, the social paradigms from which Japan was looking to expand, and then the economic reasons why they did that. And it's going to come down to oil. After all, we see even on this cartoon here, the Philippines are only a stepping stone to China. We looked at this cartoon extensively during our discussion on imperialism, and we see Uncle Sam hopping across the Pacific on his way to China. And you recall in class we discussed how China was kind of the goal for all of the imperial powers of both Europe and the United States by the open door policy that we have talked about. And Japan wanted to get in on the mix too. And so there is a sociological underpinning for Japan's reason to push back at the United States and say that the Asian theater should remain the Asian theater and that the Western hemisphere should remain under the purview of the West. So we've got Monroe Doctrine and Roosevelt Corollary and American imperialism all coming into play here at this time. If you recall the American Empire map under Alfred Mayer Thayen, the book of the power of sea, that he is going to advocate for the expansion of a very strong U.S. Navy. And that, as you can tell, is going to require both the cutting open of the Isthmus of Panama in linking the Atlantic and the Pacific, as well as the expansion of American ideals in the South Pacific through the various islands that you see here, including Hawaii, and of course, Philippines, that stepping stone that was used by many imperialists as a justification in its cession from Spain after the Spanish-American War into getting those ideas, now allowing the United States to move into China. All right, so let's take a look. Japan is going to try to kind of hold its territory, pushing back at both the Hawaiian Islands and the Philippines. In the days ahead, we'll talk about the Pacific War and kind of this island hopping campaign that's going to take place. But a bulk of the fighting will take place in both the Hawaiian Islands and, as you see there, Midway Island we'll talk about a little bit, and of course, the Battle of Leyte Gulf there in the Philippines. So we've got quite a bit to talk about as far as military strategy in the Pacific. But for today, we're just simply going to look at the United States and Japan and putting all of our eyes on Pearl Harbor. There is the Japanese Empire just after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. One of the documents that we'll be analyzing today looks at the expansion of Japan from Manchuria through eastern China and down into French Indochina. And it's going to be in pretty much this area where all of the oil fields are going to be gathered. And this is going to be a huge source of natural resources for Japan's rapidly industrializing economy and its needing of steel and oil. And so these islands are going to become rich treasure troves for Japan's expansion. But why did Japan need those resources? Well, it's going to come down to the United States cutting off those resources, Japan. I'd like to take a look at just some context for a second and let us watch together kind of the overall underpinnings of Japan's path to Pearl Harbor and why is it that this small little island chain was so important to them. Let's take a look. Or not. Technology at its finest. There we go.
The 1941 bombing of Pearl Harbor by the Japanese was one of the most devastating attacks on American soil. But just a few decades earlier, Japan and the United States were allies in World War I. So how did things get so bad between them? It all comes down to oil. To explain, we need to go all the way back to the 19th century. Once an isolated nation, Japan underwent a makeover of sorts to compete with the West. Known as the Meiji Restoration, it embraced industrialization, built up its military, and restored Japan's emperor as the powerful head of state. Aided by 2 successful wars, Japan aggressively expanded its empire. The Japanese were becoming an imperial superpower, until the Great Depression hit. You see, Japan is an island nation with few natural resources, so it depends on international trade to keep its economy afloat. The economic crisis put a stop to all that. Japan was in a bind, so its military leaders, who called the shots at this point, decided the best defense against financial ruin would be a good offense. They would invade nearby China, particularly Manchuria, for its plentiful resources like iron, soybeans, and land. Lots and lots of unsettled land. So what does this all have to do with the United States? Well, the US was a long-standing Chinese ally, and it watched uneasily from the sidelines as the 2 nations clashed in the 1930s. But America wanted nothing to do with another war, so it just denounced Japan's aggression. Tensions rose in 1937 when Japan invaded the Chinese city of Nanjing. In doing so, they attacked an American gunboat, killing 3 and wounding dozens. Disturbing images coming out of war-torn China further swayed American opinion against Japan. In response, America attacked Japan's resources. They imposed economic sanctions of aircraft, scrap metal, and other items crucial to Japan's military. The US hoped the sanctions would stop Japanese expansion. But Japan doubled down, invading French Indochina in 1940 and then teaming up with Germany and Italy. Why those 2 countries? Because like Japan, they were controlled by militaristic governments, obsessed with conquest and driven by a deep sense of nationalism. The final straw came in July of 1941, when President Franklin D. Roosevelt announced a trade embargo on oil. An oil shortage was an absolute disaster for Japan, who relied on imports for 90% of its supply. Not only would this destroy the Japanese economy, but it would put its military at a literal standstill, which meant no more expansion. Japan resented the US for meddling in its quest to dominate Asia. The only solution left for the Japanese was total war. Crush the US fleet in the Pacific and then occupy Southeast Asia and claim its resources. And so, on December 7, 1941, Japan launched its surprise attack at Pearl Harbor. At first, it seemed like a win for the Japanese, destroying or damaging 21 US ships and more than 300 aircraft, and killing around 2,400 soldiers, sailors, airmen, and civilians. But the success was short-lived. The United States declared war on Japan on December 8, 1941. Not long after, the Japanese would realize the mistake it made at Pearl Harbor. Their bombers had failed to deliver a mortal blow to the Pacific Fleet, missing oil tanks, ammunition sites, repair facilities, and aircraft carriers. Just 6 months later, remnants of the US fleet would score a key victory against Japan at the Battle of Midway, turning the tide of the war against the once mighty Japanese.
And so it is going to be at that moment that the United States finally has its reason to engage the war. Again, Roosevelt was not beset with the kind of challenges that Woodrow Wilson was set with on deciding whether or not the United States should get involved in World War I. It was clear at this point that the attack on Pearl Harbor, which still resonates with the American lexicon today, was a great justification for finally entering into the war. In fact, shortly after the attacks on the World Trade Centers and the Pentagon and the crash in Shanksville, Pennsylvania in 9/11, historians often referred to that attack as the first time the United States was attacked on that scale on American soil since Pearl Harbor. So we see that these pinnacle moments in American history really are defined by these specific attacks. And if we were to talk with generations that are, sadly few of them are still around, but throughout the many years, recalling where they were when they heard the news finally break on December 7th, they could probably tell you with that very specific kind of flash memory. And it was early in the morning on that Sunday morning. And so you have to remember, from a time frame standpoint, it was many hours ahead. So it was like 2 or 3 in the afternoon when Americans were leaving church or at home with families listening to the radio when finally this news broke in. But one of the great, I guess, rallying cries, if you will, we've also examined many songs throughout our course about the moments in American history in which we kind of rally behind the Doughboys in World War One. And now let's take a listen for just a second at one of the more famous songs by the Swing and Sway with Sammy Kaye. And this is the song Remember Pearl Harbor. And listen to how catchy this is in trying to galvanize the American populace. Let's take a listen.
History in every century records an act that lives forevermore. We'll recall, as into line we fall, the thing that happened on Hawaii shore. Let's remember Pearl Harbor as we go to meet the foe. Let's remember Pearl Harbor as we did the Alamo. We will always remember how they died for liberty. Let's remember Pearl Harbor and go on to victory.
And so it is at that moment that the United States was starting to get galvanized. Now, I don't want to paint a generalist picture and think everybody in America was ready to go off to war. We had a rather rich discussion in our roundtable a few weeks ago talking about how there was strong anti-war sentiment back at the home front. And we'll be taking a special day in the coming days to talk about America on the home front during this war. But as you could tell, a lot of this kind of propaganda, this galvanizing music was on the airwaves. In fact, that aired 12 days after the bombing of Pearl Harbor to kind of get the people to get galvanized behind the war effort. Quick little contextualization about Europe. Remember, we talked about the failure of the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations and how that's going to put Germany in a very difficult position. It's going to put the United States in a difficult position for not joining the League of Nations because of pushback from the Republicans and Cabot and those guys in Congress. We also remember isolationism. Remember, all the countries right after World War I kind of went off into their own corners and did their own thing, and economies began to develop and then devolve after the Great Depression globally, exacerbating isolationism even more. There's that global depression we talked of. Disillusionment. The Germans on their side are going to be really disillusioned with what happened after World War I. They're going to be in a position to have to apologize for the war and pay reparations, and that's going to make their economy even falling deeper into a Great Depression. And finally, a new form of leadership. This idea of fascism is going to take root under the umbrella of Nazism in Germany, and of course, fascism in Italy. All right, so on the modules, and here's where I'm going to begin to kind of cut you loose. You could pause the video here as you take a look at these documents. I want to be very clear that you don't have to print these documents out. You can simply click on the PDF underneath the form, take a look at these documents. I'd like you to read the background information that's on there. And then move into document 1, document 2, and document 3, 4, and 5. What I'll do is just briefly go through and just highlight some of the documents, some of the things I want you to look for. I'd like you to get some of your mishaps there to understand those documents and help you understand the ultimate question that we're asking: why did Japan decide to attack Pearl Harbor? Document 1 is from the Japanese Ministry of Education, as you see here on the slide. It's an excerpt from a book called The Way of the Subjects. And if you look at the date, look at when it was released, August 1st, 1941. This is going to be under the society T-chart. If we were to begin to build a T-chart on this kind of mini document-based question, this is going to be a society or a cultural reason behind why Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. We'll get to the economic portions in just a bit. But I think if we look at overall this kind of writing, we see that this was required for Japanese high schools. And I want to point out some specific words in this document. For instance, an old order. Of course, the European and American is now crumbling. Why would Japan say that? Why would this particular text say that the old order is now crumbling? So looking through your context, looking through some of the readings in these documents, what is it about the old order that is crumbling? And the ideals of Japan are represented by the principle that the benevolent rule of the emperor may be extended so as to embrace the whole world. Perhaps that is the new order that Japan is wanting. And I think this is interesting in this third bullet point. And I want you to keep this third bullet point off onto the side because it will help you to understand the map in document 2. But Japan is the fountain source of the Yamato race. Manchukuo, which is Manchuria, is its reservoir. And East Asia is its paddy field. So that's an interesting perspective. And I'd like you to keep that off to the side as we look at the map in just a second, utilizing Manchuria as its reservoir and East Asia as its paddy field. And lastly, the way of the subject is to be loyal to the emperor in disregard to self, thereby supporting the imperial throne coexistence with the heaven and the earth. So what is it about document 1? What is the main idea? Why is this significant? What is the context? This is a good opportunity to look at the H in your HAP. What is the kind of the historical context surrounding this document? What is going on with Japan that is going to pit it against the West, the Europeans and the Americans, of what they call a crumbling old order? So the guiding questions for this document is: what is the difference between the old world order and the new world order? I'm not encouraging you to put this into anything that you're going to turn in, but this is going to help to formulate your context and thesis. And secondly, what was meant by Manchuria being the reservoir and China being the paddy field? So what's sociologically is important about this document in justifying Japan's attack on the United States? Remember, Pearl Harbor was not a state upon its attack. It was only a U.S.-held territory, but nonetheless, it was still very important and vital to the United States. Here is document 2. There's a map. You'll go back and look at this on your own, and you'll see here on the Japanese Empire, that's where it was in the latter part of the 19th century, just the island, which today it was what comprises Japan. And its acquisition, watch how they kind of move through this. The acquisition in 1932 is going to go here into Manchukuo, Manchuria, also on the Korean Peninsula. You'll see there's still a lot of cultural differences, perhaps I might even say hostilities between the Koreans and Japanese today because of this occupation. So acquisitions in 1932, again, the United States is in the throes of the Great Depression. Hoover is on his way out. FDR is on his way in. And so quietly, Japan is beginning to move into, I shouldn't say quietly, the acquisition of Manchuria was a rather violent and resulting in the genocide of hundreds of thousands. So, but it wasn't on the radar of the United States per se, because they were focusing more. Again, there's that isolationism point, focusing more on themselves. The acquisition of territory from 37 to 40 is going to move now into eastern China, Peking, modern day Beijing, all the way down to Shanghai. You'll see that it's going to be geography, physical geography, that is going to slow down Japanese advancement westward, with some topography that's going to keep a concentration of Japanese forces here in the east. And then you'll notice here the occupation after Pearl Harbor's bombing is going to be now in Indochina, Burma, Thailand, Siam, and the French Indochina Peninsula, now today known as Cambodia and Vietnam. And you'll see there's those oil derricks that are down there in the Malaysian islands, as well as in the Netherlands, East Indies, modern day Indonesia. What is it about this area that's going to get Japan to move in that direction? And you'll see it is going to be those natural resources. As the video articulated, Japan really doesn't have a lot of natural resources. In fact, today, 90% of the population of Japan lives within 10 miles of the coast. The rest of it is volcanic and very uninhabitable, if you will. Or, I mean, there are people living in some of the upper elevations of Japan, but by and large, for large-scale agricultural farms, large-scale areas of land is not going to provide fertile territory. And that's why even today, the Yokohama, Yokosuka, Tokyo corridors is an industrial powerhouse. So the guiding questions for the map is, what is the difference between the world order and the New World Order when looking at that map? And again, the same exact guiding questions. I want you, when you see that map again, these guiding questions are going to help you with documents 1 and document 2. What was meant by the reservoir in China being the paddy field. So look at the map, both with document 1 and document 2, to help kind of understand those guiding questions. Document 3 is a chronology that's adapted from this book called Pearl Harbor and the Coming of the Pacific War in 1999. The chronology, while I haven't been big on timelines in the past and memorizing timelines, and I'm not expecting you to memorize this timeline as well, but I want it to provide some context for you. And so take some time to look through document 3, looking at its completion of occupation of Manchuria, Japan attacking China again in 37 and 38. And I want to look at the pace at which things really start to get ramped up. And there's also a very clear dividing line here. The U.S. begins embargo of aircraft and aircraft parts against Japan, and then FDR is moving that Pacific Fleet from California to Pearl Harbor. And then we see a really kind of agitated Japan now at this point. But from 32 to 41, well, I'm not a math guy, but that seems to be less than 9 years. Things really start to deteriorate politically, as well as through foreign policy. And so I invite you to go back and look at that timeline and kind of understand the historical context in helping you to draft the ultimate question we're asking: why did Japan attack Pearl Harbor? Document 4 is pretty straightforward. It shows Japanese imports from 37 to 41. Look at the petroleum and the steel and the scrap iron imported into Japan, starting at 380, in units of 10,000 tons, down to 88 in 1941. Look at your steel, 409 to 6, and scrap iron, 178 to 11. Now, any good document analysis is not simply going to tell me what the document is saying, but it's going to give me some context around it. What is it about this data that is going to help justify the economic side of this? These documents earlier have provided us with some socio reasons for Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, but now we're starting to get into the economic fundamentals of why Pearl Harbor and its attack was so important. And finally, document 5, Hideki Tojo is going to be commenting at the Imperial Conference on November 5th, 1941. He is the Prime Minister of Japan during this time period. He's also the War Secretary, if you will. Remember, the Emperor is the head of state, and Tojo is going to be the head of government in a parliamentary government, much like Europe. And he's going to address some very key points that's going to help to shape the societal paradigms of Japan prior to its engagement. Look at the date there, November 5th, 1941, just a little over a month before the attack on Pearl Harbor. And this is a rather extensive document that he is going to make. I'm going to get myself out of the way here. The United States has not conceded a single point. It simply makes strong demands on Japan. And I'll cut you loose to read this document on your own and to help understand, again, both the socio and the economic reasons for Japan attacking the United States. And of course, justification for the United States entering into the war. Alrighty, so there it is, ladies and gentlemen, a date which will live in infamy. Attack on Pearl Harbor. Was it something that Japan needed to do? I'm not asking if you can justify it, whether it be the United States' response to Pearl Harbor or Japan's reasons for attacking, but I just want to make it simple today. Why did Japan go after the United States? And you can then flush out that response on the submissions section of Canvas. So if you go to assignments and you go into micro rights, you'll see Pearl Harbor. This is going to be due on Sunday at 11:59. Now, as I've said in previous fireside chats, these deadlines are subject to your availability to the content and the material. I'm not expecting you to be able to keep up with all of your other classes in these most uncertain days. And so this is just a guide. I hope that you get it done. It's not that much to do, but you'll be submitting that micro write to me by Sunday at 11:59. If you can't, just message me and we will be able to provide some accommodations for you to get that to me at least, at some time. I hope this was a good use of your time. I'm glad to be back at doing history. The past few weeks have been, as we've talked about in our previous fireside chats, most unsettling and challenging. But I encourage you to use this time now to get back into the material. And by having something to do, per se, this might help with you, both in physical and in mental health. I'm available to you all throughout the day. If you need to fire off a question to me, by all means, please feel free to do so. You can do that through Remind. You can ask it on the form FAQ section. I'm going to be deleting a lot of those questions that had to do with processes beforehand because that's not applicable now. We'll change that FAQ section to our questions that deal with the content. You can also reply on the chat feature or the discussion feature on YouTube, as well as inside this module as well. So plenty of opportunities for you to ask questions, provide your insight, and I'll gladly get that to you in the coming days and weeks ahead. All right, that's it for me. Have at it. Again, go to the forum, read the introductory reading that I put on the forum, look at the documents themselves, and then submit your stuff onto Canvas. Thank you so much for a great day. I've really enjoyed this time together, and I'm excited to continue our lessons in the near future. We're going to be looking at America on the home front in the coming days. We're going to be looking at the role of minorities, both women, African Americans, Japanese Americans, and Native Americans during World War II, as we then conclude period 7. Have a great day. Be well and be wise. Associ out.